You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Maybe we could go through a little bit of that history that you just mentioned so that we can get a good idea of where this is all coming from and ultimately have a better idea where it's going too.
Yeah, sure. So I think a good place to start is probably around 1694 and with William III, who was the King of England at the time. And, you know, up until this point in time, really Western civilization, wealth was centered around land. And ownership of land was wealth. And this began a transition at this time frame of wealth transferring from the land to money. And in the way that this really began and how this all started was William was, as a lot of sovereigns were at the time, involved in a lot of wars. But he had gotten to a point where he had taxed his people so much that he could no longer increase their taxes. And he also borrowed money from wealthy individuals, bankers, if you will, of the day. And he had defaulted. And so he could not borrow anymore. His credit was no good. And yet he wanted or needed, in his mind, 1.5 million pounds to build a fleet to attack France. But he didn't have the money. And basically what happened was he got together with the bankers and they said, we have a way to get you the gold to buy your fleet. We'll get that gold from the people. We'll get it into your treasury. And that way we as the bankers don't have to put our money at risk and you don't have to tax the people. And what he did in 1694 was he created what is really the first modern central bank, the Bank of England. This is the central bank that in one way or another, all modern central banks are based upon. And the whole purpose of a central bank is to siphon money from the people to the government through the hands of bankers who profit on this activity. And what he did was he gave these bankers the right to print money. And the bankers would go out and they would collect gold from the people, give them paper notes in return, and then funnel that gold to the treasury in terms of debt that was not being financed by the bankers, but rather by this central bank, which is siphoning the money from the people. And that whole system has, over the last 330 years or what have you, since it was put into place, it has grown, it has morphed, it has metastasized, but at its core, that is the role of the central bank, to siphon money from the people to the government to carry out their aims, while at the same time enriching the people that facilitate this.
One of the big questions that often comes up is if the government is indeed just printing money out of thin air, then institutions like the Fed, who really owns this, and is this just a private corporation?
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that, but you know, if you go to let's say the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, so just to take one step back from there. So what happened was there was a at least some sense of a control mechanism in place until basically the 1970s because of the fact that there was gold behind it. As I'm sure all your listeners are aware, you know, we have not been on a gold standard. Our money is pure fiat money, basically since 1971 when Nixon removed us from the gold standard. And there's a whole lot of you know, things involved with that and the groundwork being laid for that. Post-World War II, CIA influences and all of this, a lot of overlap between the CIA and a lot of these organizations that kind of run the monetary world. You know, you had guys like Dulles, you know, the father almost, if you will, the CIA, located in Bern, Switzerland, the same location as the Bank for International Settlements during World War II. Overseeing not only CIA activities, but ways in which these central banks, you know, funded the Third Reich and funded Nazi Germany with money from Wall Street. And so you had all of these things happen between 1694 and let's call it 71 when the gold standard came off. But basically, what our Federal Reserve does, and it's the United States third central bank. There was a first central bank that Alexander Hamilton put in place. Thomas Jefferson was very much against it. It had a 20-year charter by Congress, and that charter was never renewed. They tried it again with a second central bank. That again, there were political forces against this, and eventually Andrew Jackson decided, I'm going to pay off the national debt, and this bank is going to be over. And the second central bank ended. That was around 1836. And so there was a period of time where we didn't have a central bank, but the Federal Reserve came in place in 1913. And they realized that they needed to structure it in such a way as to camouflage, the bankers behind it. And so it's a two-tiered bank. There's what we call the Board of Governors. This is the face of the Federal Reserve, people like Jerome Powell that are appointed by the president. But underneath it, you have 12 regional federal banks. You have a federal bank, a Reserve Bank of New York, a Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, a Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, a Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Basically, the 12 of the biggest cities back in the early part of the 1900s. And that's why you have places like Richmond Fed and a Cleveland Fed, but you don't have like a Seattle Fed, because it really wasn't a player back then. And if you actually go to the St. Louis Fed website, there's a question there, and it says, FAQ, who owns Federal Reserve banks? And they tell you straight up. They say, this is a quote from the website, while the Board of Governors is an independent government agency, the Federal Reserve banks, these 12 regional banks, are set up like private corporations. Member banks, and by member banks, they're talking about Citibank, JP Morgan, Bank of America. Member banks hold stock in the Federal Reserve banks and earn dividends. So when people try to talk to you and say, oh, well, the Federal Reserve, it's kind of government run, or, it's like kind of a non-for-profit thing and stuff, they're really talking about the overall Board of Governors. But underneath that, when you get into these regional banks, this is where the member banks, the moneyed interests, the heirs to the Rothschilds exert their power. So not only do they own the stock in these banks, but they also elect 6 of the 9 board members of each of these banks. So each of the Federal Reserve banks has 9 board members, and the bank members get to pick those. And so this is where the control comes in. And when you go and you look and you say, well, who are these board members that the banks are picking to, that's, for example, on the New York Fed website, you can say, who did the banks pick to represent the public? And you have people like Arvind Krishna, Chairman and CEO IBM, Adina Friedman, President and Chief Officer of NASDAQ. And when you look at these people, you can see connections to Lockheed Martin. You see, so who is really controlling the Federal Reserve is these board governors. Not board governors, these board members of the Reserve banks, which are essentially CEOs of Wall Street banks, CEOs of global international corporations. And just like any corporation, it's there to serve the stockholders, and it's there to do the bidding of the board. And in the case of Federal Reserve banks, the regional banks, those stockholders are banks themselves, and the board members are basically international globalist corporate and banking titans. So that's who the Federal Reserve serves.
Now, while we're still in the historical realms, let's take a look at the importance of the events of World War II and how they paved the way for this globalization plan. There were plans before made by the Third Reich that really resembled some of the events that we're seeing playing out right now, along with everything connected to Project Paperclip, the Nazis that we brought over involved with CIA, and how this all came together to really form this plan for what we're seeing right now.